Harkening back to the days of Ralph Klein, calling the win another miracle on the prairies in her victory speech. This was an election where arguably both leaders were less popular than the parties they had, with the UCP winning with a reduced majority, winning 49 out of 87 seats and 53% of the popular vote. Interestingly, many who were involved in the ground war of the campaign suggested the 2023 race felt like a bit of deja vu. At the doors, the urban UCP candidates heard that many of the undecided voters didn't trust Danielle Smith, which was very similar, frankly, to what they heard in 2019 under Jason Kenney. And while the UCP went from 63 seats to 49 seats and saw over half of Calgary turn orange, their share of the popular vote dropped just 2%, from 55% to 53%. For the NDP, there was a lot of speculation that if the NDP had run with a centrist blank slate NDP leader who didn't have to defend Notley's record, they would have been significantly more successful and potentially would have won government, leaving Notley's leadership an open question. To moderate our discussion today, it is my pleasure to introduce Joanne Chianello, who recently joined StrategyCorp as a manager in our municipal practice. Joanne's background includes a stellar career as a journalist covering all levels of government and a career spanning 30 years. Joanne?
Thanks, Ellen. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Some of you have had some pretty late nights, I know. So let me introduce everyone who's tuned in to our stellar panelists. Jen Gerson is joining us from Calgary. She is a journalist and co-founder of The Line, which is available on Substack, and she has contributed over the years to major news outlets, including CBC, the National Post, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. I'm sure you've seen her in lots of places, including CPAC. Anne McGrath joins us here in Ottawa. Anne is the NDP National Director, and she had previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Rachel Notley when Rachel was the Premier. Anne has also worked as the Chief of Staff to 3 federal NDP leaders. And last but not least, Garry Keller. He's a VP here at StrategyCorp, and he has held several leadership positions for the federal Conservatives, both when they've been in government and in opposition. And he served as interim chief of staff to the UPC. So thank you all very much for coming today. Look, let's just start at the high level here. How did the UPC win this election? And conversely, how did the NDP lose it? I'm going to start with Jen.
I almost think it's a little bit of the opposite of that. Firstly, the NDP right off the bat had a much harder map to turn over. So they were already challenged just by the geography. The other thing I would note is there's tons of money in the coffers in the Treasury, and the economy's in an upswing. The economic conditions right off the bat overwhelmingly favored the UCP. So for the UCP to pull out a relatively small minority when frankly, if they hadn't been led by Danielle Smith, they would almost certainly be looking at 60 plus seats. A win's a win, take it, but this is a very, very narrow win for them. Why didn't the NDP manage to pull it out? They obviously improved their totals. They cannibalized the other independent parties. Good on them for doing so. But bluntly, I don't think that they ran the strongest campaign. I think that a lot of people reflexively associate the NDP with the economic conditions that happened as a result of the oil crash in 2014. And I think that Notley needed to be much more aggressive and much more persistent in pointing out and defending her party's own record well before the writ drop. I don't think that there was enough visibility there from her. And as a result, I do think that the UCP was successful in framing this as like, okay, well, maybe Danielle Smith's not perfect, but you don't want to go back to the bad old times of 2015, right? So, fair or not, that's what I think the ballot question kind of came down to.
Yeah, we're going to get back to a lot of those, especially the UPC's diminished victory, as you might call it, and the challenges that might face for them. Garry, what did you see were the ways that UPC won it and the NDP did not?
Well, quite simply, they moderated Danielle Smith. She ran a very Premier Smith campaign all the way through, including in the debate. She stuck to her talking points. She tried to rehearse and recite UCP greatest hits, greatest wins. Funnily enough, some of those were under previous leader Jason Kenney, including in the debate where she said, well, I give credit to the UCP for doing the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, which was a hallmark of Jason Kenney's 2019 campaign. They did run a very disciplined campaign with her. She personally ran a very disciplined campaign. We did not see the wild-eyed Danielle Smith UCP leadership candidate. We saw a much more structured and a much more refined Danielle Smith trying to portray that leadership premier style. On the flip side, kudos to the NDP for taking a majority of seats in Calgary, including seats not just north of the river where they were more likely to win seats, but also south of the river as well. Now, very close in a lot of cases, but still, that is a big win for the NDP. We talked a lot about before this election about the importance of Calgary in this race, and I have to wonder, thinking back, that are there enough seats actually for the NDP to win in Calgary? That there's naturally some that are just conservative, diehard seats that are enough to get them to government. So in order to get to government, they need to also flip a couple of seats in that suburban Edmonton donut, and they got to win a seat that seat in Lethbridge back, and they've got to win a seat in Red Deer, and maybe they've got to find one or two rural seats that they can actually win. Otherwise, I'm not sure what the path to victory is just on a simple mathematic race. And they got close, but they didn't get over the hump there. We'll talk a little bit later too. There's some cases, probably 3,000 votes across Alberta in certain ridings that might have been able to flip to the NDP column if the math had lined up. So closer race than people actually see, but a win's a win.
And what's your take?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said so far. The map was very, very difficult for us. I mean, we went into last night knowing that basically we had to win almost every seat in Calgary, and the UCP only had to win a few. And we do need to be able to kind of count on a few of the seats in places like Red Deer, Lethbridge. Slave Lake was the other one that we were looking at. Some of those, I think, Grand Prairie is another one that, in the future we should be paying more attention to. But the other thing to say, I think, is that the election was decided by very few votes. The 9, like I read earlier today, I have read thousands of words on this already.
I'm sure everyone has. Yeah, all of you have. Yes.
The nine closest ridings in Calgary came down to 851 votes. So that's not very much to decide a government, right? So yeah, I mean, I think it's true that the UCP ran a disciplined campaign, and I think things started to really turn for them when the election debate, which is when people start to pay a bit of attention to an election campaign. In the election debate, Danielle Smith did not come off the way that people who were paying attention thought of her. And most people, of course, weren't paying attention. So what they saw was somebody, they didn't see somebody talking about getting rid of their pension plans and making people pay for doctors and all of those kinds of things. She was, reasonable. They're both very good communicators. And I think that's when things started to really shift. The NDP had probably a better ground game in Calgary than we've ever had before. And it was at a point where Rachel was spending probably more time in Calgary than anywhere, than home, in Edmonton for the 2 years at least, probably leading up to the election. So, it came down to very few votes. The math was really hard for us, and I think we're coming out with a very different province than the one I remember growing up. Like this is not the province of this is not a one-party state anymore.
Yeah, and I want to come back to Calgary, but before I do, something I forgot to say at the beginning, and that is viewers can actually submit their questions. We're going to take them in the last 10 to 15 minutes of this webinar. You can use it, submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. My apologies for that. So we'd love to hear your questions as well. Jen, you're in Calgary. I'm going to go to you. This was supposed to be the Battle of Calgary. In a lot of ways it was. The NDP won more than half the seats there. There's still wasn't enough. what do you think people in Calgary, what were they weighing when they were deciding their vote? I mean, it's hard to imagine that it's, they're voting for the UCP over, NHL funding, NHL arena funding. Maybe they are. What's your sense there?
Well, I do think that there was a lot of wariness about Danielle Smith in Calgary. I think there was a lot of wariness, particularly around some of the things she had previously said. I think some of her statements on COVID probably didn't hurt her as much as they might have, simply because I think we're all kind of trying to memory hole COVID quite a lot. I do think that one of the things that the NDP are going to run up against is the fact that they've now successfully cannibalized the Alberta and the Liberal Party. They're non-factors. I don't think you can look at this election result and think that there is a centrist party just waiting to exist. I mean, the NDP is the center-left party now. So they successfully managed to eat that vote, but they didn't successfully manage to win over the red Tories, which is going to be their path to victory. They need to convince those centrist red Tory types that the Conservative Party is not your father's PC party, that this is now a far-right party. And if you have a centrist vote, you need to park it with Notley, because that's, or with whomever succeeds her, because the center left is actually lies with the NDP. Whether or not the NDP needs to consider a rebrand in order to make that happen, disassociate themselves from the federal NDP, because I think they are different parties, or whether or not they need to be looking at a new leader, I think that should be all part of the conversation.
Thanks. And what do you think happened in Calgary? That was where the NDP needed to make headroads. They made a lot, not enough. Like, what are the issues specific to that urban center?
Well, I'm not on the ground. I haven't been on the ground there for a while, so I'm getting it all kind of in other ways. But I actually think that the arena deal, to me, didn't seem to be much of a factor, from what I could tell. I think just as many Conservatives are probably uncomfortable with the idea of handing that kind of money over to NHL owners, to Murray Edwards, and so I think people, I think Conservatives would have been as uncomfortable with that as New Democrat voters. I think that I mean, it is clear Calgary is a progressive conservative town. It's not UCP, it's not NDP, it is progressive conservative, and that is that politically homeless population that I think looks at just basically looks at who the leaders are, what the state of the economy, and kind of many of them probably held their nose and voted for the UCP at the end. I think that's really what happened. They kind of came home in a way. It's almost like, sometimes I always think of it as parish politics. It's not. It's really nothing more than that in a lot of cases, I would say.
Garry, what do you think? Do you think Calgary is going to be the sort of a swing city in the future, where we're down to a two-party system in Alberta, as Jen mentioned? Is Calgary going to be important now every single election? What happens?
Yeah, Calgary is always going to be in play, because we're seeing that this is a perfect example, and there were examples in the last election too, 2015 and 2019, where there were UCP, NDP straight up battlegrounds. With a few back then, there were a few other, Alberta Liberal or Alberta Party seats. But to Jen's point, those votes have been cannibalized. It's really interesting. I talked to a couple of MLAs and their staff who were out campaigning in Calgary, especially north of the river. There's kind of like a north of the river tends to be more NDP, south of the river tends to be more UCP. And when they went to the door,
I heard a pollster call it the Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah, I think personally I found that a little bit offensive, but that's fine.
Well, fair enough. All right.
Anyway, what they were telling me is, they said when they went to the doors and they said people were wishy-washy UCP. So, I voted UCP in the past. I don't know. Danielle Smith, I'm a bit uncomfortable with her. When they asked the person, but are you really going to vote for Rachel Notley this time? There was a response of, nah, I can't do that. No, I guess I'll vote UCP. And maybe that is a holdover from Notley's time as premier. What I found a bit surprising was that she totally memory holed her time as premier, like didn't talk about it, didn't. And look, there are reasons for that, but at the same time, Albertans, this is not ancient history. Albertans remember that Rachel Notley was premier. If she had said, look, I was proud to be premier of this province, like day in and day out, proud to be premier of this province. Did we get everything right? No, we didn't get everything right. But by goodness, these are the problems. We're going to fix them, and at least acknowledge that she had been a premier and had been a leader. People might have been a little bit more comfortable with her in a few other ridings that were swing seats. I just found it a bit strange that it was. Time as premier was completely memory hold, and what that did is allow the UCP to say, remember that bad time when Rachel Notley was premier? Oh, those were bad times. Look at all the litany of things that were bad, and it kind of left the field open to the UCP to do that. So I found that a little bit strange in the NDP strategy. I get why it's difficult to say that. At the same time, it's hard for Rachel Notley to say, well, because it was energy prices, and then leave herself open to, well, you're the party that hates oil and gas, right? Like it's not an easy play to pull off, but just completely not mentioning it, I thought was a missed opportunity.
Well, I think also that with those reluctant UCP voters that are really progressive conservatives, I would have probably focused a little bit on the fact that we did run a scandal-free government, which doesn't happen very often in Alberta. It's not recently. We ran a scandal-free government, and we had public sector agreements that were zeros. Like we didn't, that there was no labor, that there was labor peace without massive increases and without, no strikes or anything like that. So those things I think would appeal to those conservative voters, right? That you can have some management of the economy that includes labor peace, reasonable agreements, and scandal-free, I think, is big. So I think
Scandal, and I would also add drama-free. We haven't had under the NDP the internecine drama that we've seen under the UCP, and as we fully expect to continue to see. Right? I mean, they managed their relatively totally inexperienced caucus very, very well and with a lot of discipline. So I agree with Garry here that if they had managed to come out and say, look, we didn't get everything perfect, but we did the best we can given the global oil prices, which were beyond our control. And hey, also while we're at it, scandal-free, ran a pretty centrist, reasonable government. You weren't dealing with our internal drama 24/7. Like, we're the grown-ups in the room. Like, we are the grown-ups in the room. If they'd been able to demonstrate that message, I think they would have been in a much better space today.
The flip side to that is, and talk about a scandal-free government and discipline. Far be it for me to comment on Rachel Notley and her team's internal management style. But what I was told is that in terms of control and discipline, it would sort of make Stephen Harper blush in terms of caucus control and discipline. But you know what? Politics is a team game, and there is a reason why you have strong discipline and control in place. And 2015, you saw a lot of no-name candidates on the ballot, and whenever there were issues with them, they were very quick to nip them in the bud and deal with them and avoid long drawn-out scandal.
We want to talk about Premier Smith. We want to save lots of time, but quickly, while we're talking about Rachel Notley, what's next for her, do you think, Anne? Well,
she indicated last night that she's staying on, and I think that I personally think that that's good. I think that I think she is she's more popular than the party. That's for sure true, and I think that she is a bit of a linchpin. She holds things together, and I don't know if she'll stay on for the full term or not. But certainly, I think that for the immediate future, anyway, she'll be very important to keep things together, to bring the new people in, to have that sense of discipline, and kind of rowing in the same direction. And I don't see a lot of chatter about her leaving at the moment, anyway.
And how long do you think that will last, Garry?
Well, New Democrats are a unique bunch, unlike liberals and conservatives who tend to eat their own, especially unsuccessful leadership candidates. New Democrats tend to let leaders pick their own path out. The exception to that was Thomas Mulcair, but it probably didn't help him that he was neither a New Democrat nor a member of the union movement. So he was a bit of an exception to the rule. But even, you saw in Ontario when Andrew Horwath lost the last election, she said, I'm leaving on my own terms. There wasn't this massive, like, we've got to get rid of her, right? And so, I mean, I think NDPers, there's going to be big demand to get rid of Rachel Notley. So it's up to her in terms of she's setting her timetable, whether she wants to stick around for another 4 years or not. I mean, it's a tough slog being in opposition for 4 years after being in opposition for 4 years. But if she does decide that she wants to pass the reins to somebody, she'll have time to do that, to 12 to 18 months to plan an exit and groom somebody for leadership rather than just say, well, I'm out of here. See you later. But I think it's ultimately her call at the end of the day, whether she wants to run again or not. And time will determine that, I think.
Yeah, Jen, I'm not sure if I am correct in saying that she is either the or one of the longest
He's the longest in
has
the
been an
Yeah.
NDP MLA longer
Yeah.
than almost any other NDP.
I think she is the longest at this
Yeah.
point. She's been since
And-
2008. So the
from
risk
what
I
you
would
know
say-
of her,
The risk I
go
would
ahead.
say for the party is that is Elizabeth May syndrome. The risk here is that she can't build an NDP that is the Rachel Notley party. She needs to make sure that she's building an NDP that will survive her eventual departure, right? I mean, the sun will eventually burn out and we'll all die. That's what it is. But so I mean, I think that right now she needs to be talking or thinking about how do I build a durable, sustainable, progressive alternative in Alberta that will succeed me and who will succeed me. Like there are a lot of conversations need to start right now about succession planning, even if she's planning to run one, even two more elections. She needs to be doing that with her obvious leader at her side to build up that person's brand. Otherwise you risk turning this into great Elizabeth May. Everybody loves her. She can't win more than 3 seats, but everybody loves her. Super great. Nobody cares if you're loved. I mean, win. That's I think the challenge for her moving forward.
Yeah, the other thing is she has a substantially larger caucus now. Like this is we did win a lot of seats, and so it's a bigger caucus, and it's not a good. I personally think what you want to do is get the caucus together and not start having it divide up into leadership camps. So I think it's really important. Personally, I think it's really important for her to stay on to at least get the caucus moving and going and everything like that.
Not necessarily the whole term.
I mean that
Yeah.
I think, well, Gary's right. It will be up to her. I mean, she is
Right.
beloved in the party. She is. I mean, her father, was like a hero. He's a hero to so many of us. He kind of held the fort there for so long as the lone New Democrat from Northern Alberta, and she's a daughter of the party. Like she's who we associate with. Her father and her and her whole family.
Right.
There is a
Alright,
bit of
let's-
a warning. There is a bit of a warning sign here from previous Alberta politics, and that's the Alberta Social Credit Party. Ernest Manning had been premier for a long time. They've been in power for 30 some years. Now it's not quite the same in terms of being in power, but NDP has been in power, and there was a failure because we've always seen that, well, Ernest Manning will be around as long as the sun shines, and when he decided to pack it in, he had not groomed, and the party had not groomed a proper successor. And so you went from, an inexperienced leader in Harry Strom losing the 1971 election to Peter Lougheed, still winning 25 seats. But by the end of the decade, by the end of the 70s, they were a spent force. They were gone. And Alberta tends to see a lot of these like big wins and flameouts amongst political parties. I mean, just ask the Socreds, ask the Alberta PCs. It's not an inevitability for any political party or any political movement in Alberta. It tends to be a lot quicker in terms of how these things move in Alberta, say, than maybe in other provinces.
Yeah, the last thing I would say is that I would really like the NDP to embrace the idea of it's the never-ending campaign, right? Like the NDP has to start getting really, really aggressive about the idea of great, you all have today off. Tomorrow you're campaigning again, and you're campaigning for the next 4 years. And only by doing the never-ending campaign will they be able to be truly competitive, I think, in the province.
Do you think for every seat, or are we now just seeing a really entrenched urban-rural divide now in Alberta, as we're seeing so many places?
I mean, I think that every candidate should always be on the fight all the time. You should always be fighting for your seat, and you should already be grooming. Like this year, start grooming your next replacements in those rural seats. But yes, I mean, of course, every party is going to look at this strategically and see where their likely movements are. But I'll point out, I'm in my riding is Calgary Fish Creek. That is fortress conservatopia. All right, this should not have been close. And even in Calgary Fish Creek, the difference between the UCP candidate with some problems and the NDP candidate was only 2,000 votes. On a 4-year timeline, that means this election should be a competitive one. It maybe wouldn't be the first place you'd put your time and money, but this should be a
It could be
competitive-
winnable, you think? Yeah.
it could be potentially winnable, right? Candidate. And if that candidate starts building relationships in the community, like right now, and spends the 4 years being very diligently committed to it, I think this absolutely could switch. And I mean, I'm in conservative, I'm in Midnapore for Christ's sakes. Like I'm in Kenny world. And this, like, there's no way this should have been even remotely within 2,000 votes.
It's so interesting. Garry, Danielle Smith's opponents tried to frame her as a wild card, to put it politely. And, a lot of the things she's done in her short time as leader, just before that, while she was the Wild Rose Party, have been really controversial. That is not the Danielle Smith we saw during the election. We saw her being very premier-like during the wildfire crisis there. But just even last night in her acceptance speech, we saw a little of the before election and post-election, right? She said it was time to put partisanship aside. She said some nice things about Rachel Notley. And then she said, went on the attack with the federal government. We're in for a big battle over their energy policies. Which Danielle Smith are we going to see post-election?
I think that's a really interesting question, because now that the election has passed us, and Rachel Notley was the opponent. Rachel Notley is no longer the opponent. Justin Trudeau is now the opponent. I've been told that federal Liberals have really tried to avoid having any fight with Danielle Smith on any issue whatsoever to give her any oxygen. And it's true. Think about the last 9 months. Have the Trudeau Liberals really introduced any heavy carbon plans or anything like that don't predate Danielle Smith? Not really. The carbon tax it's previous to Danielle Smith winning the leadership. The only time they've really done anything is when they've accidentally stepped in it. When David Lametti said, well, maybe we should revisit the Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba's rights over natural resources. It created such a big fuss in Alberta and the prairie provinces that they had to walk that back immediately. So they've avoided doing that. The federal Liberals, they can't avoid doing climate policy forever. 9 months is one thing, the remainder of their federal term is another. So I think we're going to see a really interesting situation where the Trudeau Liberals have to press forward on their climate plans, and Danielle Smith's going to be probably the leading voice opposing those. And so, I think we're going to see a lot more Alberta versus Ottawa, because I think that's what the UCP believes its base wants to hear after the election.
Are we going to hear more about the Sovereignty Act, Diane?
I think so. I mean, and I actually think that the Trudeau Liberals might want this fight now. Now that the election is over, I think Danielle Smith is a perfect foil for them. I think that Justin Trudeau versus Danielle Smith might be a ticket that they're looking for.
How so?
Well, because I think that
does that help them in their fight against the federal Conservatives?
I think so, because like they put Pierre Poilievre and Danielle Smith together, and
he did endorse her. He did endorse her in the last few days of the election officially.
Exactly. You put those two together. You talk about the pension stuff. You talk about paying for the doctor stuff. Talk about Trump. In the context of the upcoming U.S. election, I think it's the adversary that they want.
Jen, I think I heard you say on CPAC in the last few days that, see how this election goes, but if Danielle Smith wins, we're going to be back here again soon. What kind of leader do you think she's going to be post this election?
Well, I mean, I would amend that a little bit to say, we're either going to be back here again within 18 months, or she's going to be premier for the next 10 years.
Oh, okay.
It's going to be one or the other. Scenarios. But essentially, I mean, look, I mean, she has a lot of interesting figures in caucus. The majority is not necessarily a strong one, and she has factions operating within her party that are going to continue to push her further and further to the right on any number of issues. Will that faction be placated on anything? I mean, I think it's anybody's guess. It didn't take a lot to push Kenny out, not necessarily because, as she says, nobody really stood up for Kenny in the long run. Is she going to be able to manage a caucus, maintain popularity within that caucus, and how should I say, take control of some of the wilder factions that are now trying to take over her party. That's a pretty tall order. What could happen is that faction will essentially be like, you're not living up to our expectations. We're kicking you out, and we're going to put somebody further to the right in. You know, I don't know that, or she will be able to gain control of that faction and basically run a lasting and secure conservative coalition for a generation, and in which case we'll remember her as the next Ralph Klein, right?
Oh, how hard will it be for her? Oh, go ahead, Ed.
She's got a very minimal urban representation there. Like, she's got no seats at all in the capital of the province, and not a lot of seats in Calgary. I mean, it really is pretty rural as a party now.
I was going to ask, how hard will it be for Premier Smith to govern, given that smaller caucus, a little bit more to the right? She, three folks in Calgary who were cabinet ministers right before the election was called are gone. They lost it. They lost, how hard is it going to be to put a cabinet together and have people who can govern, Jen?
Will vary. And I think, as Anne pointed out, there's just not a lot of Calgary bodies in the room anymore, right? There's not a lot of Edmonton bodies in the room. There's no Edmonton bodies in the room. So yeah, you're right off the bat, you're drawing from a very rural caucus. There's not a lot of law degrees in the room. My concern with this is that, Danielle Smith has a lot of good qualities, and I think people underestimate her at their peril. But one of her Achilles heels is that she's got very poor information hygiene, is kind of what I would put it. She's got poor judgment. And if she's surrounded by people who are really smart, good diversity of opinions, who are advising her well, she'll make good decisions and she'll make smart decisions. And if she's surrounded by a bunch of people who are rural, individuals who are coming from a particular informational environment that insulates them into a particular worldview, the only input she's going to get is going to be that point of view. And there's not going to be a lot of people standing up to challenge her perceptions on things. So, I think it's going to be very hard for her to put together a cabinet full of people who are come from a diversity of places and a diversity of viewpoints. There just aren't very many moderates left in the caucus period, right? I mean, there's Rajan Sawhney, that's offhand. I couldn't think of another. I mean, Gary, help me out. Offhand,
Rebecca Schultz.
Schultz, yeah, absolutely. So Schultz will be in there. Sawhney will be in
Nate
there.
Glubish from the Sherwood Park. Sorry to interrupt, but this is a good segue.
I asked for help because, like I said, from what I can see, a lot of the moderates, a lot of the people who were kind of more establishment figures, not all of them, but a lot of them have been either ousted or they didn't run again.
Yeah, Gary?
Yeah, it's a good point. I made a quick list here, just running down the defeated candidates who are ministers or were ministers. I mean, starting with Tyler Shandro. I mean, there's going to be a recount there. He's only losing by 7 votes right now, but recounts are pretty tough to turn over. And remember, he was a minister of justice who told Danielle Smith, Premier, you can't ask and keep poking around Arthur Pawlowski and this idea of pardons for people. Like, it's just not on. That's not how our system works. So he's gone, likely. And you look at the list.
Voice of reason.
Jason Luan, Prasad Panda, Josephine Pond, Jason Copping, Jeremy Nixon, Nick Milliken, Whitney Isick. These people have been cabinet ministers and are tended to, I think some of them, not all, but some of those names were moderating voices around the cabinet table. They're gone now. And who are they replaced by? And so you talk about longevity. I think, the Premier has probably 12 months to really put her stamp on things and demonstrate competence and leadership. Can she form a cabinet with existing? Yeah, of course she can form a cabinet. Sure. And there are some other people in that cabinet, like Nathan Newdorf held his seat in Lethbridge. He'll definitely move up the food chain. And so probably some of the people even around the Edmonton donut, Dale Nally, even Cyril Turton in Stony Plain, Spruce Grove. There are some opportunities, the new candidate from the Beaumont, but it's not going to be a huge list of people. And maybe, Anne went through this in 2015. The first cabinet the NDP had in 2015, what was 13 members? We may not see a cabinet of 30 ministers in a party that won 49 seats. We may see a much more slimmed down, pared down cabinet.
Well, Garry, while I have you, I mean, what does this mean? The UCP at least tries to talk to them, present themselves as more business friendly, right? So what does this mean now, this win, smaller win for the UCP? What does it mean for doing business in Alberta, and for the, both for businesses in Alberta and other folks who want to do business with Alberta from outside the province?
It's a good question. There was one issue on the campaign trail that UCP actually, I think, scored some real points on, and that was the NDP pledging to increase the corporate income tax rate by, I think it was like 3 points, but on a strict increase number, the UCP were portraying it as a 38% increase on corporate taxes, and I think that was a real a bit of a challenge for the NDP to get through. So, the NDP or the UCP were clearly indicating Alberta is open for business, taking a line from Doug Ford. We want to have low taxes. We want to have a competitive environment. And to Jen's earlier point, the economy is humming right now in Alberta. What better sales pitch for a premier in the province to say, look, everything's going great and we're going to keep taxes low. We're going to encourage business, come to Alberta and live the dream. So I think, there's lots of opportunity, I think, for business out in Alberta. It's going to take some time. We'll get a cabinet together, but I don't think that will take too long. And we'll have to wait and see what things play out. But yeah, I think in certain sectors as well, there are opportunities for sure.
Anne, do you have a sense of that?
Who's going to be the finance minister?
Any guesses from our esteemed panelists here on that one?
I'll vote for Schultz.
Yeah. I mean, I think for businesses in Alberta, like, this is the other thing, is that they're going to have a strong, the new government is going to have a strong presence in Calgary, because that's where a lot of that has to take place. So even though the government is in Edmonton and they have no seats in Edmonton, they have a few seats in Calgary, I think they're going to have to really beef up their presence in Calgary to make sure that there's some access for the businesses there. And they're going to have to figure out how to businesses are going to have to figure out how to talk to these MLAs, because they're going to be a bit different than, like, I mean, some of them are there because of Take Back Alberta, right? And they might be hard to talk to for some businesses.
Is that going to be a problem for corporate Canada or medium-sized business Canada, Jen?
I mean, I don't know if I can speak particularly well to medium-sized businesses. My business is pretty small. It's me and Matt.
You would have gotten a tax break, I think, under.
Yeah, exactly. But look, I mean, I don't think that it's any illusion that the UCP has the better perception as being good for business. I think that whether or not the UCP and the NDP have in reality any significant or substantive differences is pretty debatable. I do think that it was a mistake that the NDP sort of signature policy in this election, or the most visible policy that they had in this election, was a corporate tax increase, even a moderate one. That didn't serve them as being the most visible thing that they were proposing. But I would say this, is that if there is any whiff of crazy or separatism, that is going to scare businesses off. Bluntly, we got Rob Anderson in the Premier's office. Rob Anderson is tied to an initiative that is not overtly separatist, but is certainly mused about the prospect of an Albertan independence if they can't bring Ottawa to heel. If I were a business person, great, you're going to lower my taxes. Super, but you want to turn this province into Moldova, an independent Republic of Moldova. Awesome. Good job, everyone. So if they can keep a clamp on that, great, super. But if they can't, and if the crazy gets out of the bag, that's not going to go well for Alberta business.
Well, along those lines, go ahead, Garry, sure.
Yeah, I'm an Albertan born and bred. I'm from the Edmonton area. I love my home province, but you know what? Albertans sometimes like to talk a good game about, oh, we're not into corporate welfare, and no, we're gonna not spend, and this is gonna be a limited. I mean, Danielle Smith brought in a budget that was just spend. And I think, for me, circling back to our earlier discussion about the arena deal in Calgary,
$300 million, yeah.
First of all, Edmonton didn't get the same deal when they built their arena, but I love, what I thought was quite funny, because it also speaks to the Calgary-Edmonton divide. When she announced it, it was, we're finally gonna get this thing done, because you Calgarians, I mean, you don't want to have to go to Edmonton to go see the best shows and the best things. We're going to do it right here in Calgary. It all kind of reminded me of that Simpsons episode where, well, you wouldn't be interested in that. That's a Shelbyville thing. But when push came to shove, she had put $300 million on the table, and everyone was like, man, I'm hankering for that new arena. Boy, that's going to bring the Flames and all these great things here. Sure. Yeah. Okay. So Albertans, sometimes we like to speak out of both sides of our mouths, even the most rock-ribbed conservatives.
And I would just, to the point that Jen made, if there is controversy, what does that mean for business? If there is an elevated fight between the province and the federal government, what does that do for business? That's actually two questions. Like, what does the battle or possible battle between Alberta and the feds mean for the rest of the country?
Well, it's not great. It won't be good for anyone. I mean, businesses won't like it. I think Jen is right. They'll just like run for the hills for sure if that happens. And I think that for the rest of Canada, it's quite destructive. And I think it's not what Albertans want either. I can't speak for them or anything like that for Albertans, but my sense is that whenever these issues come to the forefront, people are very uncomfortable with it. Like this, whether it's the Sovereignty Act or any of those kinds of things, there is a bedrock of support for this, some kind of, separation or independence or whatever. But for the most part, I think most Albertans really do believe in being part of Canada, being distinct, being different, being who we are, but being part of Canada, I think, is pretty integral to Albertan identity, I believe.
We're going to take a couple of questions. We're going to go to one question because this is something I know I'm interested in, and I think a lot of people are interested in. We touched on it a bit, but Stephen Lewis asks, what was the impact of Take Back Alberta on the rural vote? And is Take Back Alberta going to continue taking over the UCP? And, are they going to push Smith on policy? I think we talked a little bit about that as well. I think I'd like to talk a little bit more about that urban rural divide that we're seeing a lot more in politics and in southern cities like the United States, like in Texas and Georgia. You see that where you have more centrist urban centers are overwhelmed by the votes outside of those cities. So let's start with you, Jen. Do you mind? That's not a very clear question. That's a giant subject.
Yeah, so if we just start with Take Back Alberta. So
rural divides, yeah.
I think that it will take probably some more post hoc parsing of the data to see what the impact of Take Back Alberta was. I think that they boasted about essentially fielding or backing 14 candidates. Garry, you might be able to correct me on that. So they're there, and we know at this point that they've essentially taken over half the UCP board. So here's the thing. I think that you have people who are not totally new to politics, but this is where sort of the young blood is coming into the UCP at this point. These are people who are further to the right than I would say most of the province is, and they're very much of a populist nature. They're highly influenced by the sort of populist right-wing waves that are coming out of the United States, albeit in a Canadian context. I don't want to overstate that. And again, this is where a lot of the momentum and energy is coming from within the party. I don't see a lot of momentum and energy coming from old hands of the Redford campaign. You know what I mean? So this is where this is from. So I don't think that their ambitions have been slaked or sated. I do think they will continue to try and take over more and more of the party. If Smith and her team are not prepared for that, they are going to get in trouble pretty quickly. I do think they will try to flex their muscle on policy. Their actual power is pretty confined and pretty limited. But what's interesting to me is that Smith doesn't act as if it's confined or limited. She seems to take their calls and she seems to take them very seriously, probably more seriously than they ought to be taken. The other flip side to all of this is that, okay, you can take over the UCP board, but let me tell you, you've just signed up for a lot of grunt work. And that doesn't necessarily put you in charge of anything except being voluntold. You know what I mean? So how much control is being in how power the board is, how much power is that actually going to give them over policy? I think a lot of that's going to come to how well Smith can actually manage these people. I don't know what the answer to that question is.
Garry, what do you think? I mean, we've seen it on the federal level where people very much on the right put the leader in charge, and then the leader can't really run on that those policies because they're going to lose. So how do you think that translates to the federal level? What does Pierre Poilievre take away from this election going into the next federal election?
I'm not sure you can directly apply the provincial result to the federal result. Like, I mean, NDP winning a bunch of seats in Calgary is not going to convert into some federal orange or red wave at the federal level. I do think, if there were 14 candidates that they supported, Take Back Alberta, give or take in Alberta. I mean, so what did they increase? Rural UCP's vote from 7,000 to 8,000, like, big deal. Who cares? So what? You won. You got 70% of the vote anyway. And were you out campaigning in Calgary ridings? Did the UCP lose some of those ridings? Well, maybe it had the opposite effect. Like, was Take Back Alberta trying to win the Lethbridge West seat? If they were, they didn't succeed. They actually failed in that approach. And so I think where the real risk results is the rural MLAs, some of them who are Take Back Alberta people and owe their nomination wins to getting organized around Take Back Alberta, are now kind of beholden to that organization, and that organization may try to keep those MLAs and say, well, you promised to do these follow things. If you don't do these things, we're going to have another Take Back Alberta challenge you for your nomination in 2 years' time. I think that's where there may be some challenges in the rural area, but I'd like to parse that data a little bit more, but those ridings where they were effective, did they flip UCP to NDP? And if they did, then you'd have to say, well, they failed.
And do you think, what do you think Pierre Poilievre takes away from this election going into the next federal election?
I don't think he can take a lot, because I mean, Alberta is pretty unique in a lot of ways. So I'm not sure he can take a lot away from it. And also, I'm not sure that's where his focus. Well, I'm pretty sure that is not where his focus will be. I think his focus is going to have to be BC, Quebec, and Ontario. That's where he needs to get seats. And so I think he'll be pretty focused on those. And I think he knows that what works in Alberta doesn't necessarily work in downtown Vancouver.
We have another question in from one of our web attendees. It says, Alberta, the Alberta budget has a mammoth redirecting of oil funds toward green investment. It's the largest move from all the provinces so far. When we start seeing the green transition fueled by these funds, how will the UCP explain this to voters? Will we see a more moderated approach to climate change policies? Anybody want to have, who would like to start with that one? Jen, I see you're unmuting yourself. Is that?
Yeah, I would say that is a longer and slower term process. Look, I mean, I think that if Alberta makes a rapid transition to green technology, the UCP will be thrilled. It's economic windfall. Great, super, awesome.
It's not an ideological thing, right?
I mean, like, well, business is an ideological thing. So if Alberta can make money doing a green thing versus an oil thing, or in addition to an oil thing, great for Alberta. I don't think that there's, and just talking a little bit with Smith, I don't think she's like closed to the idea of a green transition at all. And I think she would hail any successful business here, period. That said, do I think that you're going to see a UCP that's going to go all gung-ho on a carbon tax, even if all of a sudden we become the leading producer of windmill technology? Probably not. Probably because I don't think that they would even see that necessarily as a tribalistic framing, but rather they would just see that as, hey, I don't want more taxes, right?
Gary?
I think it depends on the green industry. Look, Alberta, going back to Kenny, has had this hydrogen strategy very much focused on blue hydrogen. So hydrogen derived from natural gas sources. The area in and around the Edmonton area, it's called Heartland. It's been self-dubbed the Heartland. There's a lot of producers of hydrogen, and they've created this carbon trunk line to encourage CCUS, so carbon capture and storage. So I think it depends on the industry, because blue hydrogen can coexist with the oil and gas industry because it's used in using natural gas, potentially used by the petrochemical industry. It's a supportive technology to the energy sector, not necessarily at the expense of the energy sector. And both Kenny and Smith have been willing to invest in this. I don't think that maybe you're going to see like massive investments into solar panels or those sorts of things. And I think it's probably late for Alberta to get into. We're not going to manufacture batteries in Alberta. We're not, Ontario and Quebec are sort of, cornering that market. The main question on this for me is, how does Alberta get its hydrogen to global market, given the difficulties in shipping hydrogen and all those sorts of things? But I think it's an open question yet. And to Jen's point, hey, if there's money to be made and it attracts more companies to Alberta, great. If it's an addition to the energy sector, even better.
Is Smith's government up to the task again of this? Shift?
This goes back a little bit to the discussion about businesses and how the government deals with businesses and how businesses deal with the government. I mean, most of the businesses in Alberta, I would say a lot of them anyway, are pretty invested in transitioning to greener energy, greener economy. And so if she ends up in a pitched battle with the federal government over some of this stuff, that could be problematic, I think, for some of those businesses. And she'll have a hard time managing that.
How well positioned is Premier Smith?
And if I could just say also in the context, particularly of the kind of investments that the federal government is making right now in things like, whether it's Stellantis or the VW plant or some of those transitional things in kind of contrast or in I guess competition with the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. How does Alberta fit into that? And if you're in a pitched fight about transition and green technology and stuff like that, then you've got a problem.
And there's a flip side to that. Yeah, there's a flip side to that. The feds will also try to find ways not to pick a fight with Alberta. So where are there areas that we can agree on that are a win-win for both sides? And I think about the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is obviously not just a standalone organization, but takes signals from certain areas. Jason Kenney, when he was premier, was able to negotiate a deal or put forward or advance a deal to help fund Alberta's southern irrigation districts using CIB dollars. The feds were in on that because it was a checklist for them. It was checking a green initiative. It was federal dollars for the CIB, so they could get along. They could find a place where they weren't picking a fight. And so there will be ways that the federal Liberals also want to find ways to do that. And there may be opportunities for businesses that are a win-win-win situation.
But Gary,
Chrystia Freeland signaling that in the last couple of days when she was talking about the regional implications for, when she was talking about the Stellantis deal in particular and other regional markets.
But if Alberta and the feds are having a pitched argument over net zero electricity, for example, is it likely they're going to put a Stellantis-like deal, multi-billions of dollars of investment in Alberta? Jen, what do you think?
No, but they never were because there are no votes here.
So that was never happening anyway, you think?
I don't know about that.
I mean, they'll throw some money at us for the just transition stuff. I mean, they don't want to see 100,000 oil workers out of work. That reflects poorly on them. So yeah, I mean, they'll throw some token cash at us, I'm sure. But bluntly, the reason why the Stellantis and all of these and the VW stuff is happening in Ontario is not a coincidence. Firstly, it's already a hub for car manufacturing, but also because this is where the votes are.
But Alberta hasn't been completely ignored. Strategic innovation funds. There have been a number of like hundreds of millions of dollars flowing to Alberta through that program. I agree with Jen. Like, there's no votes here, but it's also not a barren wasteland for federal provincial cooperation.
And I wouldn't say that, nor would it be fair to present it that. I mean, also let's point out that the Liberal government bought the Trans-Canada pipeline. If they were trying to starve us out, I mean, they wouldn't have done that. So like Alberta can't really complain about capital investment, I think in the long run under the Liberals. And yeah, like I said, I think it would be probably benefit them to throw a couple billion more to some green projects here or there. I suspect they probably will. We'll probably see some money going to SAIT and DATE for training and that kind of thing. But are we going to see a $13 billion plant pop up somewhere south of Red? No.
But remember that Trudeau launched his 2015 campaign in Calgary.
Yes, yeah, that's true. I was there. And that was quite the interesting campaign event. And definitely he started out his campaign with a very conciliatory sort of peace bridgey attempting tone with Alberta. I think that in 2015, there was some genuine goodwill and some genuine hope to try and break into this province in a significant way. Hasn't really panned out.
Yeah, is that what goodwill still there, do you think?
I think it's harder with this government.
Yeah. Quick question on recession, because that's always a very light and happy topic, very brief. And let's start with you as you're here. How well positioned is Premier Smith to deal with a possible recession?
Well, again, it goes back to her caucus, right? She's got I don't know how her caucus will respond, and she's got a lot of caucus management issues ahead of her, I would say. So she's, as Garry was saying, she's going to have to put together a cabinet with not necessarily the group that she would want to put a cabinet together with, and so in the case of a recession, she would. She's also betting a lot on the oil prices staying where they are, and that may not be the case. Certainly, the signals out of OPEC and those kinds of things. I don't think that. I think if there's a recession and she has to deal with that, her approach so far seems to be to spend a lot, and I don't know how comfortable or competent really she would be in trying to manage spending and still keep the good healthcare system and education system and all of those kinds of things, which is I think what Albertans expect from any government.
Jen, what do you think?
So when Jason Kenney came to power in 2019, his big winning pitch was essentially the socialists tanked the economy, vote me in and I'll fix it. I'll put a war room in place. We'll lower corporate taxes. We'll fix it all. We'll bring business back. He comes to power, and for 2 years, really that didn't happen. The 2 years after Kenney was elected, before COVID, were not financial bright spots. The businesses didn't come flooding back. The oil prices didn't necessarily come crashing back for a while.
The debt was not reduced by giant amounts.
Yeah, exactly. That didn't happen. So Kenney was, how to say this? Kenney was in trouble with the electorate before COVID hit. This is something that people kind of forget. They think, well, Kenney's handling of COVID is what tanked him. That's not really the case. Kenney overpromised, underdelivered, and then glided for a couple of years. Then COVID hit. So he was already really struggling, and then had to deal with the COVID mess, right? So I'm going to just draw that point because I'm going to say, once again, we have a conservative premier coming in. This time the economy is doing pretty well. Money's in the bank, coffers coming in. You want to vote for us. You don't want to vote for those socialists because you remember how dark that time was. You remember how bad the economy was when the socialists were in power. And if the economy tanks and oil tanks, and all of a sudden there's another 2014 like bust, Smith's going to have to eat that. And now all of a sudden the parallel between her and the evil socialists doesn't look so stark for a lot of people.
Well, the parallel between her and Jason Kenney doesn't look that stark, right? In a situation like that, I think voters are in a recession situation are willing to accept, some deficit spending in a short-term deficit spending, but I think COVID prolonged that, and it wasn't just COVID. vaccine measures that helped to do in McKinney, but it was probably some of the spending where you had to take back Alberta's the world saying like, we're going to support candidates who are going to get serious about cutting spending and living up to their promises. Jason Kenney didn't live up to his promises. The reality is when you're running a government, you are faced with those challenges. Just ask Stephen Harper and Jim Flaherty in 2008. They were running a very different budget, and then the global financial situation happened, and they had to respond. They created a $55 billion deficit that they did manage to pay off in a short amount of time before the election. Fat lot of good it did them in 2015, but any leader has to deal with it.
The other thing I would point out is that, we're coming into this with a group of people who are very ideologically motivated when it comes to fiscal management, as evidenced by their election promises. We have people who've said, look, we're not only are we going to cut taxes on low-income earners significantly, but we're going to put a referendum in place to ensure that any future tax increases will have to go through a referendum. Well, you only have to look at the states to see how that turns out. And add to that the fact that we are a jurisdiction that spends heavily and is heavily dependent on resource royalties that are incredibly volatile, as we've seen in recent years. So, like, sooner or later, and whether or not we're talking 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, but sooner or later, the oil prices are going to crash. The resource royalty is going to tank, and you're going to be cut, or some conservative government is going to be facing significant and very painful cuts, increasing taxes, which they've hampered their own ability to do, or dependent on debt. They've set themselves up. There's nothing fiscally conservative about what they have proposed here.
And the cuts were weighted more towards the urban communities than the rural.
Absolutely, they will be. Because they have to be. That's where the people are, right? I mean, that's what it's going to be. So, you with your own policies, you've set yourselves up for a fall. It's just a question of when.
So, folks, I'm sorry, I'm going to cut you off there because we're a little bit over, but that's fascinating. And I'm just wondering if I can ask you all for like your 20-second wrap of like what you're looking for in the short term, what you will be watching for. Anne?
I'm going to be looking for chaos in the legislature.
Okay, well, that might be fun, not great for the people of Alberta, but we'll take.
I think it's going to be.
You think that's what's going to happen?
I do. I think that it's going to be tough to put a cabinet together. It's going to be tough to maintain any kind of caucus discipline, and there are a lot of people expecting things that may not come their way, and that's going to be a problem.
Garry, what are you looking for in the short term? What are you going to be watching for?
Quick turnaround from the Smith government to get back to business, reappoint a cabinet, bring the legislature back quickly for a quick session, pass one bill and get out of here before the summer. And cabinet, I actually don't think it'll be that hard to create a cabinet. It might be a smaller cabinet than before because you don't have many spots to fill, but I think it'll be a quick turnaround for the government.
Jen, how about you?
Oil prices. That's what I'm watching. I think this government is going to live or die on oil prices. If Smith gets 5 years of strong oil prices, she's probably in for 10.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, Anne McGrath, NDP National Director, Garry Keller of StrategyCorp. I should know that one. I'm also from StrategyCorp, and Jen Gerson, the co-founder of The Line and you can see her a lot of places. So thank you all very, very much.
The Line is excellent.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna look you both up and make sure you're paying subscribers now.
That should. Thanks very much. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.